need to talk about it.
First, I want to thank everyone for coming today to this year's Haber Memorial Lecture Series. And this year we've got Anthony Steinbock, who's a professor of philosophy at Southern Illinois University. His expertise is in phenomenology, not only scholarship in phenomenology, but he actually does phenomenology, which nobody does philosophy. He's published lots of articles on, first of all, topics in phenomenology, also on French and German phenomenological figures, including Husserl, Scheler, Merleau-Ponty, Mariade, Levinas, and others. He just finished his second book, which is coming out shortly from Indiana University Press. It's called Phenomenology and Mysticism, the Verticality of Religious Experience. His work has been translated into German, French, Italian, Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. He's also given presentations all over the world. And he's also the general editor of Northwestern University Press's book series, Studies in Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy, which is one of the most prominent book series in continental philosophy. He's also editor-in-chief of Continental Philosophy Review, one of the upper echelon or the journals in continental philosophy. And his presentation today, which is taken from his upcoming book, by the way, which there are flyers for in the back near the food. And today's presentation is going to be is entitled Mysticism and Religious Experience.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Department of Philosophy and the Philosophy Club and the Hopper Foundation and Professor Mark Kanzer for the kind invitation to speak to you today. Very honored to be here to do this. As Professor Kanzer mentioned, this is a presentation that's developed from the book, so I'll be able to present some of this thought, at least in outline form here. In general, my effort is to give an account of a specific dimension of human experience and its own evidence that's traditionally left out of philosophical treatment. To give such an account, we have to operate, however, with a substantially broader view of experience and evidence than we customarily admit into our inventory. For example, we usually think that what counts as evidence or what can be experienced are empirical or even intellectual objects. The spheres of experience and evidence that are more robust than just that of objects, those of objects, the spheres of experience more robust than those of objects, I call vertical givenness, or for short, verticality. Sensitivity to vertical givenness is not accomplished by constructive metaphysics or by applying either theological convictions or ethical belief systems to experiences, but by taking a phenomenological approach to these different kinds of givenness. That is, by evaluating what's actually given in human experience, thereby expanding our notion of evidence. This expansion opens us to religious, moral, and ecological spheres of experience, even though the quality of these kinds of experiences is fundamentally different from the ways in which objects are presented in perception or in judgments. Because the religious, moral, and ecological dimensions are given, each in their own unique ways, they're susceptible to critical philosophical thinking. There's a kind of disorientation that I term, just for short, idolatry, and I will be happy to articulate that later. But it's what I understand as deforming or reversing, if you like, the vertical givenness. And I use this term idolatry despite the fact, and precisely because it does not and indeed cannot accommodate itself to a postmodern worldview. Unfortunately, the identification of idolatry as the root of problems we face today can be too easily read as a call to fundamentalist violence. And it's quite understandable that one would want to avoid using so-called religious terminology today, given the pervasive stronghold on religious conservatism and sometimes tyranny of orthodoxy, the easy association of anything religious with spiritually and physically violent movements. But I think we would avoid the religious dimension of experience as a whole for these reasons, only at our own peril and at the hazard of missing a crucial dimension of our lives. Furthermore, idolatry encompasses a wide range of experiences that run counter to verticality, and these include experiences like pride, secularism, as well as fundamentalism and humanism, and in relationship to the earth as ground environmentalism, which I contrast to a positive notion of ecology and a sense of deep ecology. I'm not going to go into that today, but just to kind of give a kind of outline of where this is going. So let me first, my first section here of the paper is called Givenness and Experience. By taking experience as a touchstone for reflection, I am concerned not merely with what is there in experience, but how this what appears to us. Phenomenologists, for example, have traditionally expressed this how of appearance under the general title of givenness, or modes of givenness. Experience means the way or the mode in which something is given to us. Among all philosophical attitudes, it's been the virtue of phenomenological philosophy to call into question the naivete that structures our everyday life, or taking it for granted by carrying out a shift in perspective. It accomplishes this by holding in abeyance the assumptions pertaining to life as we live it, and by suspending the prejudices concerning the being of things. It does this in an effort to expose how their meanings arise, and to understand the structures of those meaningful experiences. So the central issue in phenomenology is not necessarily immanence or transcendence, not necessarily subject or object, but I think more fundamentally givenness and the problem of givenness. Phenomenology can be understood as a methodological attempt to practice a disposition of the self for a possible openness to givenness. Such a practice can lead us, perhaps beyond our own efforts, to the forgetfulness of the self as an openness to perceptual and epistemic objects, but also to whatever gives itself in its own manner. So to the epiphany of the holy, to the revelation of other human persons, to the manifestation of cultural products, to the disclosure of the earth, and to the display of elemental beings. Something counts as a matter of experience to the extent it can be given, and in principle one should be open to all kinds of givenness, which is to say all types of experience without discrimination, no matter how paradoxical the givens may seem to be. Traditionally, there's been an arbitrary exclusion of areas of experience from philosophical discussion. Because there are certain areas of experience that are conceived in advance as not being able to be described meaningfully, since they are putatively not given, many of our reflective enterprises have been dismissed as so much theology, sophistry, speculation, or dogmatism. In my view, this exclusion hides a contemporary, deep-seated and widespread prejudice, one so powerful and pervasive that has dominated nearly all contemporary thinking on these topics, even if it has not been expressed in this way. The prejudice is this: all matters, especially those that concern the holy, have to conform to one type of givenness in order to be given and hence to be experienced. If they don't conform to it, they're said to remain essentially on the limit of experience and are subject only to theory, speculation, or mere personal belief. Phenomenology is a style of philosophical reflection, however, that's trained on the given and in principle on however the given gives itself. Since the central issue of phenomenology is givenness that bears on experience, phenomenology is in a privileged position to surmount this arbitrary restriction of evidence to one kind of givenness and to inquire into the givens peculiar to verticality, and that is to say, all different kinds of what I'm calling vertical givenness. So, a little subsection here, section A, the sphere of presentation. The mode of givenness that has dominated a philosophical and especially phenomenological way of seeing, I call presentation. That's not vertical. Presentation is a type of givenness that is peculiar to sensible and intellectual objects, and is more or less dependent on my power to usher things into appearance. The dynamic interplay of my phenomenology, my power, my ability, and the effective pull of the object, the intersubjective orientation to the world, the passive association of sense, the constitution of both simple and categorical objects, the background structure of the phenomenal field, All of this belongs to the province of presentation and is governed by its systematic interconnections and laws. For the purposes of this presentation, I don't want to dwell on the structure of the presentation. It's already well known through the work of the early phenomenologists like Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Gurvitch, and others, just to name a few. Now, there's nothing intrinsically problematic or illegitimate about this order of givenness, namely presentation. However, the difficulty has been and continues to be that presentation is assumed to be the only mode of givenness. While presentation describes the dimension of our experience that concerns the relative givenness of things and the economy of appearance and concealment, and while it describes our relation to the world as one of both immediate and mitigated belief in its being, presentation has become the dominant model of givenness for us and has been allowed to efface other legitimate modes of givenness. But why should phenomenology, in order to reflect within the very experience in itself, not open itself to all kinds of givens in the distinctive manner that they give themselves? Is it not an act of forceful arbitrariness to limit in advance the ways in which givenness takes place? Precisely because presentation has defined what gets counted exclusively as a matter of experience, vertical relations have been left virtually out of philosophical and specifically phenomenological accounts. So now let me turn, subsegment B here, to vertical givenness. I use the term verticality because of the existential sense it bears, the orientation, the meaning, the dynamic movement it evokes. Vertical givenness, or verticality, expresses a lived directedness, religiously, morally, and bodily, ecologically, like when we aspire to reach new heights, when we look up to someone, when we value the life of another beyond our own, when someone honored or esteemed is held in high regard, when we are upright, both morally and physically, when we're in an elated mood or uplifted because of an event or at the sight of a friend. And it also implies the antithetical movement of folly. In fact, if we were looking for a meteorological expression to evoke vertical movement, updraft might be an appropriate term. In philosophical literature, the concept of verticality has been largely ignored or suppressed, but it's cropped up every now and again, erupting into contemporary thought and discourse. Bachelard, for example, was acutely aware of the significance of verticality when he wrote, and I quote, "the truly positive experience of verticality." We can also look to, and I won't cite these instances, but Irvin Strauss, the upright posture, and his descriptions. Merleau-Ponty, for example, shifts from transcendence to depth to verticality in his last work. Auden, poet, writes, "Let us honor, if we can, the vertical man, though we value none but the horizontal one." And so we see the vertical emerging in poetry, in philosophical works, in literary works, and it's this term that I'm reappropriating. Verticality is the vector of mystery and reverence. Horizontality is what is in principle within reach, graspable, controllable. I prefer verticality to the term like transcendence, because the latter is encumbered with too many philosophical and religious presuppositions, that opposed to immanence. In this respect, I also find it illuminating, as I mentioned, that many of the contemporary phenomenologists will evoke this term, verticality, precisely to articulate a new sense of being. So what I understand is that the unpredictability of the vertical, the dangerous, the spontaneous, what is undomesticable, the quality of the vertical is incomparable with what we predominantly value and are encouraged to value. If we live in a horizontal world that suppresses the vertical, it is nonetheless a world that is susceptible to verticality and beyond its control. It is a world into which the vertical erupts. So, for me, verticality evokes and signifies those dynamic vectors of experience that have a unique structure of their own, harbor their own kinds of evidence and manners of givenness, and as such are irreducible to the field of experience characterized by what I call presentation. What is given vertically incites awe, and only later, as a consequence, wonder. Modes of vertical givenness are vertical in the sense that they take us beyond ourselves. These modes of vertical givenness are testimony to the radical presence of absolutes within the field of human experience. Now, by absolute, I mean a presence that's so unique that it can be predicated neither of singularity nor plurality. Uniqueness would be the operative term. Absolute, in this sense, is not synonymous with universal. There are three main spheres of absolute experience: the religious, which pertains to the vertical experience of the holy; the moral, which pertains to the vertical experience of the other person; and the ecological, which pertains to the vertical experience of the earth as aesthetic ground. The general project relating to this work is to describe vertical kinds of evidence. Each mode of vertical giveness has its own manner of giveness, its own internal coherence and regularity, its own essential interconnections that pertain to evidence, modalization, deception, illusion, etc. So epiphany, revelation, manifestation, disclosure, and display are distinctive modes of vertical giveness, and each of them are distinctive in kind from presentation. Although there are several forms of vertical giveness, I'm just concerned here with one kind, what I'm terming here, epiphany. Accordingly, I treat the dimension of human experience as opened up by this kind of giveness, and is therefore devoted to phenomenology of religious experience. So this is just like one mode or one dimension of vertical giveness, what I term epiphany, which concerns phenomenology of religious experience. Okay, second section, the specificity of the religious sphere through mystical experience. One can speak meaningfully of religious experience in an indeterminate and general manner. Yet religious experience can also be understood in a more determined manner. For example, as the experience of living in the presence of the holy. While religious experience may be given in many different ways, there are certain religious experiences that hone in on what I consider to be the most profound character of this givenness. These are called so-called mystical experiences. My attempt at further qualifying religious experience depends upon clarifying it interpersonally. I appeal to the mystical experiences to clarify the interpersonal nature of religious experience by drawing on selected mystics, not because they exhaust the range of interpersonal experiences, but because their experiences exemplify them. Mystical experience is a discrimination occurring within the religious sphere. It is characterized by special intimacies of the presence of the holy. These special intimacies are not restricted to, but can include intimacies more commonly associated with experiences like union. I draw on, so there's a wide range of experiences that are not simply, everybody's things focused on union. There's many variations of these kinds of presence, of these kinds of givenesses, depending on the mystics we look at. There's the Hanbali in the Islamic tradition, as this one work, this is from the 12th century, but more than 1,001 different modes of givenness. St. Teresa of Avila, depending on the early account, 4, and then later 7 Jewish mystics, often 7, the particular Jewish mystic I work with, Rabbi Dofer has 10. But the point is that these are all like not union. As a matter of fact, in the Islamic tradition even goes beyond union. There's an experience of subsistence by God that goes beyond union. So these are all different types of presences that cannot be subsumed under union. Anyway, I draw on mystical experience to clarify religious experience, and thus the structure of epiphany, because mystical experience refines the evidence already given in the religious sphere. Mystical experience can do this because it lives the immediate person-to-person movement that may only be, but do not be implicit in religious experience as such. In this way, the mystics can become exemplary of religious experience by highlighting the evidence of epiphany as a distinct vertical mode of giveness. Accordingly, as paradigmatic of religious experience, mystical experiences are always religious experience, but not all religious experiences are mystical ones. Admittedly, this makes religious experience less general in the sense that it does not pretend to cover every spiritual tradition, East or West. But by the same token, it makes it all the more distinctive. By experience, in general, I mean the givenness of something, an object, a human person, holy, as it is lived. By mystical experience, I do not mean everything that's non-rational, weird, exotic, occult, paranormal. I mean the self-giveness of the holy as a personal presence, as its presence is lived. The self-giveness pertaining to the holy is a vertical mode of givenness, namely epiphany. Epiphany is the personal presence of the holy, and the mystical experience is precisely the personal givenness of the holy as it's lived in an especially intimate manner. Okay, Third section, mystical experience. My approach, as mentioned above, is a phenomenological one. I take this approach because it's one that bears most directly on the matters as experience. Insofar as the holy can be said to be experienced, these experiences are open to critical description, even if they don't conform to descriptions with which we seem to be most familiar, like the experience of tables and chairs. This is why it's necessary to be open to a broader field of evidence. Such a task is a philosophical phenomenological one and not theological. The phenomenological style of description generally appeals to first-person experiences. It does this in an effort to be faithful to the matters as they're given. Edmund Husserl, the so-called father of phenomenology, and the phenomenological method appeals to a special disposition toward these matters, what he calls reduction, so as to let the phenomena appear as they give themselves, and to describe the phenomena as they give themselves, untainted by accrued prejudices of mind and habit. Rather than mere conceptual explanation, the phenomenologist's effort is to guide us to a point where the matters can flash forth of themselves, stirring us in the lived experience he or she is trying to awaken. If the phenomenological enterprise has a role to play in the description of spiritual, religious, and even mystical experiences, it's because it's a shift in perspective that in principle is open to all kinds of giveness, and thus in a position, however modestly, to orient us to them and not provoke them, it doesn't cause them. Still, the problem remains that one of the difficulties when writing about mystical experiences concerns the implicit claim to first-person access to such experiences. For the descriptions, since I harbor no pretensions to such experiences, it would seem that without them, one is doomed either to dishonesty or mere speculation. This is one of the reasons I appeal to the accounts provided by the mystics. It's an appeal to the authority present in the mystics by virtue of their experiences, an authority that is given in and through the experiences, and not from a commitment to a philosophical theory or by theorizing about the nature of God. I privilege the first-person accounts of several mystics because they provide a point of access for phenomenological description. By first-person accounts, I do not necessarily mean autobiographical accounts. It is not the history of the person or the facts about the person that are of import, but the description of absolute experiences that differ essentially from the presentation of objects. The modes of watering the garden or the chambers in the interior castle, understood as prayer in St. Teresa of Avila, the 5 kinds of divine soul, understood in terms of ecstasy in Rabbi Dov Ber, the states and stations of unveilings in the Islamic mystic Ruzbahan Bagli, and so on. The focus is not the individual or his or her so-called mental states, but the given lived vertical experiences. Such accounts are available in the spirit of the mystics, faithfulness to the self-givenness of the holy, a faithfulness emphasized by their unrelenting appeals to experience as the condition for everything respective mystic rites. In and through such first-person accounts, we can be attentive to the complex texture of givenness, or the presence of the holy, as well as to the modalizations of this unique kind of evidence in possible deceptions and illusions. Though the mystic's primary concern is not the mere description of evidence, many of their records are nevertheless there for us and open for us both descriptively and evocatively. The fact that these first-person accounts stem from others and not from myself, for example, should not be taken as an impediment, but a privilege of access. It's not clear, in fact, that the description of our own first-person experiences demand any less examination than the description of the first-person description by others. Even my own description of my own first-person experiences are distant reflections on my own experiences. And to this extent, they can coincide with others' reflections on my experiences. From the accounts provided by the mystics, we can discern basic structures of experience and relate other descriptions of mystical experiences to them without having, for example, to put myself in the place of the other, as it were, which by the very structure of the uniqueness of the personal experiences is impossible. It's true that my descriptions of my bodily movements are distinct from others' descriptions of their bodily movements, for example. But phenomenology, as a cooperative effort, never excluded others' first-person accounts in an effort to clarify the phenomena. Phenomenology, instead, did not wish for third-person, ostensibly objective accounts of our life world to wear the mask of truth and to parade as self-subsistent and thereby to dominate the field of lived experiences. I do not have to have had the experience of a phantom limb as an element to phenomenology of perception in order to give a phenomenological account of it as an ambivalent presence in the global kinesthesis of the lived body and my being in the world. So when we study, for example, St. Teresa of Avila, Rabbi Daubert, Ruzbahan Bagli, and these are all mystics of the Abrahamic tradition. If we study their distinctive kinds of experiencing, their encounterings of the holy that are nuanced by their religious backgrounds and their distinctive witnessings preserved for us in writing, all this evokes an open sphere of spirit that does not exhaust its uniqueness in the lives of the individuals. Their experiences illuminate what being human can mean, since they are possibilities of experience actualized or actualized essential possibilities. The fact that their lives elucidate an essential possibility does not mean, on the other hand, that we're all mystics. There are abundant works that display a prejudice against this sphere of experience because it does not conform to the presentation of the givenness in the way objects are given or ideas. Just as there are numerous reductive approaches that try to understand mysticism in terms of aberrant mental states, psychodynamics, psychoanalytic object relations, cognitive psychology, and comparative sociocultural analyses. With these medicinal, psychological, psychoanalytic, and sociological diagnoses and analyses, myths is that the presence of the holy is given with its own structure, its own immediacy, and so-called order, and as such does not need to conform to a narrow, restrictive view of experience in order to count as a different kind of experience. Bergson wonders, for instance, how the mystics could have ever been grouped with the mentally ill once we grasp the internal movement of their lives and spirit. Admittedly, we live in a situation of unstable equilibrium, whereby the health of mind and body, as well as their pathologies, are not easily defined. Yet there is an exceptional mental healthiness, Bergson writes, what Husserl would term a hypernormality that is readily recognizable, a healthiness that is expressed in the penchant for action, in the faculty of adapting and readapting oneself to circumstances, and to the spirit of simplicity that triumphs over complications. This should not suggest that one cannot be deceived or that one cannot suffer from self-delusion. It does mean that there are not sociological, historical, and cultural matrices. It does not mean that there are not sociological, historical, and cultural matrices in which the mystics live. In fact, the mystics themselves are the first to admit it. Indeed, it is a quite legitimate question to ask whether or not there is a lived phenomenological difference between, say, mystical experience and what we understand today as psychopathology. It would be premature on my part simply to give an answer without having to give due consideration to how the mystics themselves handle these and similar questions. What I can say here, however, is that when the mystics attempt to sort out a genuine experience from a deception or from a malady, they appeal to operations on or within that level of religious experience, and do not reduce the religious, say, to the psychological or to the vital level of this sphere of experience. The fact that they are able to pose the question concerning a delusion and the attempt to distinguish it from a genuine experience of divine presence, and to see these experiences within religious tradition, presupposes epiphany. And most importantly, it calibrates the problems they encounter in their own terms and within that sphere of evidence and experience. So when we're examining the quality of givenness as described, for example, by St. Teresa of Avila, we can say epiphany has an internal clarity, a power and authority and depth. These are all different terms used. It's coming from elsewhere. It's immediate. It's sudden, non-anticipatable. Each experience being complete, full, or absolute. For St. Teresa, these are qualities of the experience that could not be given, that could only be given in the religious experience itself, even though she attempts to evoke them through her descriptions and imagery after the fact. Indeed, if we wish to equate fullness with objects of presentation, then we'd have to say that epiphanic givenness is overfull, superabundant, and as in the refrain of the mystics, without measure. To say that this presence is experienced absolutely and fully, however, does not mean that the holy is exhausted in the experience. But if the experience is surpassed by an ever-deepening presence, or if it's renewed, it takes place uniquely. Further, these kinds of presence of the holy are qualified as sudden, coming on of their own accord, as spontaneous, as creative, as immediate, without any sense of our being able to anticipate or control them. The holy is so received in such a way that it alters the structure of the experience itself, and it makes a qualitative difference in how we live within the world and with others. Accordingly, such vertical experiences are confirmed as authentic according to the nature of the experience itself. For example, Rusbahan-Bagli does not appeal to perceptual experience to confirm a different order of experience, say a spiritual experience. He neither appeals to a proof through rational demonstration, nor does he appeal to his own assessment of his so-called progress, because we can be deceived. So what do you think is progress? Rather, there are, for him, intersubjective confirmations of his experiences, and these are given by the saints, the prophets, the angels, and even Muhammad himself. Of course, such a cooperation might appear to be circular in presupposing what it should confirm. That is, if we're looking for some kind of proof that the experiences are authentic, from outside of those experiences, experiences that are so-called objective and can be adjudicated by others as true or false, then such confirmations would appear to be just as much in question. Why do angels, saints, prophets, and so on confirm these experiences when we might say in turn, well, that's all well and good, but what tells us that these confirmatory experiences are themselves authentic? Do we not need another set of evidentiary confirmations to verify these intersubjective confirmatory ones? Don't we need something more tangible, something that's precisely not of the religious order, in order to verify this other order, the religious order of experience? Otherwise, aren't we back where we started? The fact that Rusbahan-Bagli, and not just him, he's just that one, because I think these are the most interesting ones, his confirmatory experience and so on. Okay, the fact that he cites these intersubjective sources and not others indicates to us immediately that the verification of the set experiences, this is the point, that the confirmation is internal to its own kind of experiencing. That's the point. And it has to occur on this level of experiencing and not outside of it. So we can't try to adjudicate moral experience by religious ones. We can't try to adjudicate moral ones by perceptual ones. And shift in these kinds of modes of givenness to say, well, okay, this is a true moral experience of the other person because I can confirm it by certain perceptual examples of experience. There is and there can be no external adjudication or justification from the outside, since they can be authenticated only in the manner of this kind of givenness and experiencing. So perceptual evidence, for example, cannot authenticate spiritual experiencing. The experience of loving another person, or being in love, or being loved by another, can only be confirmed within the same kind of emotional sphere of experiencing, and not, for example, by rational reflection on the loving or any experiencing that is different in kind. Rather, it has to be internal or consistent to its own domain. Just as perceptual experience can only be disappointed or confirmed within a kind of perceptual faith, as Malcolm calls it, such that what is given perceptually can supplant a previous perceptual givenness, so within its own realm, and accepted as such, so too can a vertical experience only be disappointed or confirmed within the context, in this case, of a religious experience. Drawing on the mystics might seem to be counterproductive in discerning basic structures of religious experience. How can the descriptions of such, so-called elite persons be taken as descriptive of our relationship with the holy, and as sketching, however modestly, the structure of these experiences? It is precisely the purity or the refined character of their lives, and not the fact that there are few or many, that enable us to see more clearly the essential structures of that founding interpersonal sphere. That's quite contrary to the mystical relations being exclusive, isolated, rare. They're instead exemplary. of what's going on or already going on in the interpersonal sphere for all of us, and open in principle to all of us, though most of us live it rather obscurely or maybe in a misdirected manner. Now, do we have access to these experiences? Yes and no. Yes, to the extent that epiphany is happening all the time. The effort required is one of bracketing oneself, in a religious context, that is, to liberate the vertical dimension in the things themselves and in ourselves. The effort is to liberate oneself, expose oneself, so we can perhaps be struck in similar ways. The disposition of the self, however, is not merely an intellectual exercise, because such a divestment of the self is lived through, for example, as home service, which may entail what the mystics refer to as poverty, obedience, and so on. No, it's not. We don't have access, in the sense that many of these epiphanic experiences that we're describing here, on the basis of the mystics, are themselves beyond the pale of one's own efforts. So there's a distinction across the Abrahamic tradition of a kind of experience that can be so-called acquired and what's infused or beyond our efforts. And to that extent, we don't have access to them because these experiences are not even in our control. It's not like I could turn the light and say, oh, look at the keys or something and point everybody to it, because it's a different logic of experience that it doesn't correspond to my power of disposition. So in this sense, there's nothing one can do to provoke the dimension of experiencing. Indeed, St. Teresa of Avila instructs it's prideful to go around worrying ourselves that we do not have these special experiences, and there's certainly no point in diluting the significance and uniqueness of mystical experiences so that we think they're simply at our disposal and within our discretion. Still, one may object, if religious experience is so singular, how can the so-called idiosyncrasy of the mystics really not just be a sign of their pathology? Are psychoses not really just what religiously inclined folks want to call mystical experiences? The writings of the famed Dr. Schreber, analyzed and popularized by Freud, highlight some of the difficulties in discerning differences in such experiences. For example, Dr. Schreber writes lucidly so here I'm saying, okay, right, so we talk about all of these, let's look at Schreber. Okay. He also writes lucidly from his first-person perspective about being in direct communication with God, of having a mission to redeem the world and to restore it to its lost state of bliss, of being the recipient of divine miracles, or so-called rays of God, of becoming God's wife, of assuming passivity in relation to God, of bodily functions being evoked miraculously by God, of regarding God Almighty as his ally, of suffering and privation for God. He also notes that his experiences exceed human understanding. The divine revelations cannot be expressed adequately within the confines of human language, he writes, and for this reason he must resort to images and similes. So far it sounds like reading St. Teresa. Are these not religious experiences in attempts at expression, like any of the other ones we encounter in the Abrahamic tradition? Now, there are, of course, nuances in Schreber's case. For example, Dr. Schreber describes in an attitude of both rebelliousness and reverence, God not needing to be acquainted with living human beings, since he only needed to have intercourse with corpses. He maintains that God is only nerve. He writes of his own emasculation by God as a precondition for a new race of humans being created, of his voluptuousness as a taste of bliss, of his right to scoff at God, a right that belongs to him and him alone and not to others, of his identification with Jesus Christ, and so on. These are, you don't really find that exactly in the other mystics, but okay, it's a good point. So we have to notice several things here, I think. First, the attempt to evaluate these descriptions to the extent possible is the attempt often referred to within a religious context as discernment of spirits. So it makes it a while. So I want to raise the question, is not Freud himself attempting this discernment of spirits, even if in an ambivalent way? Well, Schreber too, maybe. On the one hand, Freud immediately situates Schreber's writings within the framework of psychopathology, due in some part, perhaps to Schreber's own self-diagnosis. His ideas are said to be of a pathological origin. He is assumed to be a paranoid and delusional. I mean, Freud just writes it off. On the other hand, when Freud writes that Schreber's attitude toward God is so singular and so full of internal contradictions, it requires more than a little faith to persist in the belief that there's nevertheless method in his madness, or when Freud reduces these experiences to the order of religious paranoia, Is Freud himself not delimiting a sphere of religious experience via negativa? These are not real religious experiences, for example. Are these not signs of humility on Freud's part by saying that these are only attempts at an interpretation? Second, within the context of religious experience, the relation between the mystic and so-called religious paranoia may not always be that clear for us. If the mystics, as I mentioned above, are hypernormal, then what it means to be normal, as it is unfolding within human experience, is still in the process of becoming normal. In the process of establishing norms, in the very process of establishing norms within experience, generated within, not from outside. The religious life is in this sense, optimalizing. Well, this is how Husserl understands normal as optimal, not as avenue. So in that means in the dynamic sense, there is not a final sense of normality that already is worked out in advance outside of human experience that we then apply after the fact to experience. If there's a difference between the normal in the sense of optimalizing and the pathological, it's a difference that lies in the integrity of religious experience itself, and not in its conformity to a stock set of external standards. Furthermore, we cannot rule out the possibility that one could have religious insights, mystical experiences, and then lose them, misunderstand them, or misinterpret their significance, not just intellectually, but the core of one's being. It is entirely possible that psychoses could be taken as mystical experiences, that mystical experiences and mystical experiences be taken as psychoses, or genetically speaking, that mental pathologies had originated as mystical experiences. And there's a large body of literature. I mean, you can look back also in the Talmud, the famous story of the four rabbis who attempted to gain the presence of God and entered the garden. And one went mad, one committed suicide, one converted to Islam, and so but then Rabbi Akiva, who actually came out unscathed, so there's a tradition of saying, yeah, these might be authentic, which maybe you're not ready yet, and you can develop psychosis from these experiences too. So I think it's an ambiguous dimension, and it has to be admitted as such without a definitive clarity. So the religious experience that I'm trying to explicate is fundamentally open and not closed. It's not susceptible to a definitive clarity or to an imposition of outside standards. It's not only psychoanalysis or psychotherapy that sometimes wants a kind of clarity at the risk of betraying the experiences in the very name of doing justice to them. Religious fundamentalists also desire this kind of definitiveness, such that when the truth is pronounced, everyone's going to be driven to accept it. It's within this attitude of closeness or fixity or arbitrarily limiting the holy by our designs, implicitly associating the holy with thingness, idolatry, that both secularism and fundamentalism become modes of idolatry. But finality, writes Levinas, makes a poor bedfellow of the infinite. Such a limitation in the name of definitiveness is a sign of arrogance at best. It betrays a basic ontological vulnerability within the holy to harbor the pretension that we could sort out the mystery in any ultimate sense through, say, psychoanalysis, religious doctrine, or philosophy. This is an expression of pride. Does this mean then that we must abandon any and all critical or philosophical or phenomenological perspective of discernment? Although one cannot discern, say, psychosis from mystical experiences with absolute clarity and definitiveness, perhaps we could note some clues for discernment, clues suggested by the mystic's experiences, but nevertheless clues that do not provide a final key for dispelling the mystery in which we find ourselves. I have to mention Tarkovsky's film, Nostalgia, if any of you know that. It's a brilliant film that deals precisely with this issue. So, for example, to repeat some of the features disclosed by the mystics that I mentioned earlier, and on the basis of the authority of their experiences, we could ask, are the experiences expansive or narrowing? These are what the mystics cite. Do the experiences lead one to embrace all levels of reality or to shrink back from existence? are these so-called effects of prayer, or experience that one lived in the service of God, love of neighbor, welcoming a stranger, or do they yield the shunning of others? Is there a devotion to God more than the devotion to the idea of God? Is one left cold, frustrated, indifferent, with a sense of calm and interior peace? Or do the experiences open one to deeper values? Or do they limit what can even appear as value? Is the attitude toward nature a devaluation of it through what Nietzsche might call ressentiment? Or is it a revaluation of it in relation to spirit? Does a later experience or insight disclose something about a former one? Is one left humble or prideful? Is one left fixated on the communications, visions, or locutions? Is there a service or devotion despite the so-called gifts? Do the experiences tend toward the abandonment of self or toward the attachment to self and things? One can certainly submit an experienced presence, the givenness of the holy, in the form of prayer. These are global terms that they use for experience in different traditions. So ecstasy or unveiling, you can certainly submit them to interpretation. Such religious experiences are embedded in a religious tradition and in an individual's personal relation to the holy. St. Teresa of Avila, just to give one example, constantly attempts to test these experiences after the fact. Whether a particular givenness, say the prayer of quiet, the prayer of spiritual delight, the prayer of rapture, is actually from God or from another source, like self-delusion or an illness, like rabies, who says, it's much better simply to forget this whole thing because it might just be caused by rabies. And another one of the young novices that was under her, they're saying, I'm having this experience with God, and so I should go and look. The problem is you're fasting too much. Go. And so, it's just not like everything is fine. So this can be understood perhaps as a hermeneutical endeavor. But to say that hermeneutics at this level is called forth in ascertaining the evidence of prayer, ecstasy, and unveiling, to say that religious experience given at the pleasure of God is nuanced by the richness of the historical context is to my mind different from saying that the presence of God emerges only from a dialectical interplay or negotiating of meaning, that epiphany is given only through the give and take of the interpretive enterprise. I agree that the interpretation of the presence of the holy is a formidable undertaking, and if one wishes to call the practice of what is known generally as a discernment of spirits as an interpretive enterprise, then I would concur. But then, what one must take into account in any such designation is that there is an essential difference between the modes of givenness in which the holy is given, the way that the mystics describe, the authority of the givenness, the spontaneity and the like, and the way in which objects are presented, that there's a fundamental difference there. If we assume that hermeneutics characterizes the field of the latter, namely presentation of the way that objects are presented, then I think we should be careful in cavalierly applying the term hermeneutics loosely to mystical experiences. I want to avoid calling religious experience hermeneutics, plain and simple, because this tends to make the presence of God relative to me and to my powers, and this ultimately would be an expression of forcing my will in the presence of the holy, which is to say, to commit idolatry. What we must avoid at all costs is a new type of positivism that creeps in under the name of hermeneutics. Put differently, a hermeneutics of religious experience must itself be situated and relativized by religious experience itself in its unmistakable features, made salient by a givenness that it is incapable of producing. At least for the mystics of the Abrahamic tradition, there is perhaps what one could call a question of God. But this question is not something that I pose, that I command. Rather, it is a question that takes hold of me, or if you will, a response that solicits my first question. One further note that I hope clarifies the scope of my approach and its self-defined limits. I focus here on a core of experience that is revealed and developed within the Abrahamic tradition. That concerns the person as it's lived in terms of verticality. These are not neutral or universal experiences, but what I call further absolute. So there's a distinction between absolute not unfold on the basis of person at all. Zen Buddhism, for example. But it is peculiar to the Abrahamic religious traditions that the experience of the absoluteness of the holy, sometimes expressed as the oneness of God, is expressly cultivated. This is described in a personal manner. Because they live from the experience of oneness of God, the mystics often share more with each other, even though they spring from different religions and religious backgrounds, which is something we saw in the Middle Ages, the connection between the Jews and the Christians and Islam and the Sufis. They have more in common with each other than do the mystics and the so-called believers who have the same confession. Among the mystics, we can see a true ecumenical dialogue taking shape without any attempt to be ecumenical, because they're coming from the same source. My point here is that the Abrahamic religious traditions, in them, the personal dimension, or rather the interpersonal dimension, becomes a specific determination of religious experience, such that absolute experience can be qualified as vertical. It is precisely from the experience of verticality that we're able to confront our contemporary social ills and acts of violence as at root idolatry. Certainly there are many, many dimensions to the Abrahamic tradition, and to focus on it is not to reduce Judaism to Christianity to Islam. They are experientially unified, however, about what I'm calling the vertical experiences in relationship to which the acts antithetical to verticality can be criticized as idolatry. Let me emphasize that my investigation into religious experience is not an attempt to give a global narrative of the sacred. In this respect, this work is self-avowedly not comparative, in the sense of a work that deals with all religious traditions or various types thereof. It is not an attempt to survey all spiritualities from a putative neutral nowhere. The abstention from a surveying attitude on my part does not arise because I think there's simply too many, such a vast quantity, so it would be impossible to do so. Rather, my focus on the Abrahamic mystics emerges from the singular integrity of these sets of experiences that can be understood as vertical. Further, just because there are religious possibilities that can be revealed other than the Abrahamic ones, does not mean that the Abrahamic interpersonal reality is somehow arbitrary, as William James would misleadingly say. True, the position that I develop is gleaned from certain experiences and hence cannot claim to be exhaustive or definitive. By the same token, because these religious possibilities originate from experiences, they are not mere possibilities. They are historical realities, and hence they can't be arbitrary either. Nevertheless, they can be decisive. And even though I'm able to recognize that these other possibilities can be decisive for others, in a way I don't experience them, and that this way is given as decisive and lived as the way for me, or the way for them, experience emerges as such. This decisive way that we encounter, or rather, it's from this decisive way, this way that is the way, the way, is the way in which I encounter other ways that are not lived as decisive for me. And hence it goes back to the problem of the home and the alien, and the alien that's experienced precisely in the sense of home. I'm sure you're familiar with this. We live in and through the home toward another that is not lived as home, that is experienced by us as so-called alien. That there are other ways we know from the testimonies and encounters with others, Hindus and Buddhists and others. Because of such encounters, our way cannot be lived as exhaustive or definitive. So I make the distinction between what's lived as decisive and what's lived as exhaustive or definitive. A decisive absolute experience, absolute in the sense I mentioned above, is not a universal perspective. It is precisely this irreducible structure that makes experiences like conversion a possible and living reality. Critique, as exercised from the home, is not and cannot be universal. It is, however, intra and cross-cultural. It's a possibility of cross-cultural critique. That's not a universal critique. In the former case, if it were simply universal, that is, universalist definitive stance, in this case, one abstracts from experience, from history, from tradition. In the other sense, from the perspective of decisiveness, one lives through the experience and encounters the other. Rather than this decisiveness, to speak in relativism, it points to the irreversible character of religious experience and to an interpersonal experience in general. It is also what prevents one both from establishing a perspective as a universal meta-narrative and from writing to the lowest common denominator. One winds up doing the latter when he or she only wants to speak of spiritual experiences rather than religious or interpersonal experiences, to do this in others, because, well, spirituals fits them all, and it's less selective. The danger here is that one establishes a privileged discourse and a set of experiences as ostensibly neutral, which then insidiously and unwittingly asserts its hegemony over all the others in the name of a spurious universal accessibility. Instead, these descriptions are rooted in the Abrahamic tradition and the unity of these experiences, as I intimated above. So the point here is that there is we can attempt to discern a particular structure of experience, that's given within the religious sphere that has its own kind of evidence, but also its own problems of illusion, its own problems of disillusion, its own problems of self-deception, but it has its own logic that's qualitatively distinct from the way in which, the give and take is of the perceptual realm, foreground, background structure. And the task is to describe what is that kind of givenness, what is that kind of logic that gives its own evidence peculiar to this kind of experience. Thank you for your attention.
We have time for questions.
Please.
I have a question about the role of interpersonal. Of the interpersonal in the religious experience, especially with its connection to Abraham. And I'm thinking of, and I appreciate the importance of the interpersonal, especially as is articulated by Levinas insofar as we come to the divine through the relationship together. But my problem is with, as Silencio makes clear during Trembling, and as Derrida kind of re-articulates and we get to death, the Abrahamic, or the foundation of the Abrahamic tradition, especially in the trip to the father of Melech and Moriah, is the importance of that is it's specifically non-interpersonal, insofar as once you try to cross the interpersonal dimension, the relationship with God seems to be compromised, precisely because, as Silencio and Derrida both make clear, Abraham cannot relate to Isaac almost in any way until he establishes that relationship with God. Thus, the interpersonal relationship seems to break down.
Well, I'd probably have two responses. I mean, what I mean by interpersonal in this sense is that it's, so maybe in a more general sense, but I can call say something about that. But I think how I'm using interpersonal here is in the sense that there's a certain quality in the mystics experiences of it being in relationship to a loving center. And so there's a certain, well, in the case of the mystics I'm working on, it's much later than Abraham himself. What I find when I speak about the Abrahamic tradition, what I'm focusing on here is, on the one hand, the so-called oneness, the experience of the oneness of God, the absoluteness of God. And in all the Abrahamic traditions that emerge, there's a critique of what one can call generally idolatry. And from Abraham and Moses and Jesus and Muhammad and all the so that's generally those kinds of experiences that I'm focusing on. So the question then is, in what sense is this a personal, what could this be, interpersonal Abraham? I'm not so concerned, personally, I'm not so concerned with that for what I'm doing because of the kinds of experiences that I'm tracking within the mystics. But I'd try to focus on a different moment of the Abrahamic, the Akida, the binding of Isaac, and that would be the interpersonal dimension with Isaac, in the sense of the challenge of human sacrifice and the ethical moment that emerges in that experience. On the one hand, you have both the experience of God, the oneness of God, the absoluteness of God, which I think would be the interpersonal moment there, and with all the ambiguities that bring with it. And I think this is peculiar to what the mystics encounter. Is this really God? Is this worth the devil? Is it myself? It's not quite clear anyway why Abraham it says, okay, he's ready to plunge the knife in the eyes of, let's say, and all of a sudden he sees a ram over there. Not real convenient. I thought, okay, God, okay, well, that was close, thanks. I mean, well, and then how do you know, it's the Kierkegaard thing, how do you know it's not like the devil anyway, doing this? But I think that the focus, at least in the Judaic element of that, would be the ethical moment, which would be the abolition of human sacrifice, and with the ambiguity of the experience of God. But I still think, even in Kierkegaard, though, you have an absolute relation to an absolute. And this absolute relation to the absolute is something that is peculiar to the religious experience in its immediacy. And this is the problem. And if we're going to develop that, it has to be appealed to within the religious experience itself. And this is why Kierkegaard says, well, you can't talk about it, it's incommunicable, and so on and so on, because, well, he reduces the ethical to the social active. But nevertheless, it's still that experience of like not being able to appeal outside of it. I can't say, come here and look. I can't, look at my experience. I mean, maybe not. The mystics appeal to a confessor. You always have a master or a confessor as part of the adjudication, or they appeal to Scripture. Abraham didn't really have that going on, so it's a little bit difficult to say that. But I still think there could still be an interpersonal dimension there in Abraham, but you're not quite clear about that other person, which is to say, in this case, the holy. That's how I try to.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of dealing with this issue of where do we establish that Abrahamic tradition? Because it seems to be so clearly a relationship insofar as this is how we relate to the other, and insofar as the divine comes into that relationship with the other. And like I said, it's really clearly articulated in Levinas. And I think also that Kierkegaard in the postscript kind of comes back to merging the ethical with the religious. But I guess my problem is not so much with you, but it's with Abraham and Valencia. Where do they get? Yeah, how do they have this reinforce the ethical dimension to the religious? How do they reinforce the fact that I am obliged to the other, while at the same time saying God's telling me to kill myself?
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I don't think it's that. And this is where I think that's probably a problem with Kierkegaard. I mean, I think it's Kierkegaard and Levinas are both peculiar in both these respects, in a different way. On the one hand, Kierkegaard, you have an absolute relation to the absolute as God, or the holy. But the ethical is Kant. It's like we're basically taking over from Kant, universal, communicable, and so on. Okay, so you kind of lose that. Well, at least in this other sense. Levinas, you have just the other way. Well, not just the other way around, but it's also peculiar because you have the absolute relation to the absolute, what he calls revelation as opposed to disclosure and totality and infinity. But you don't really get any clear sense of the religious, as a matter of fact. It's very troubling in that respect, sometimes. For the most part in Levinas, because any movement toward God is immediately turned toward the other, the turning of me toward the other. And when in a totality and infinity, because it's like that text in a moment, every time there's a talk about religion or whatever, it's like that's the social or that's the cultural. And really what we mean by that is our relation to the other. And then in other texts, when he talks about relationship to God and philosophy, it's like, well, you don't have, the problem is he's appealing to certain Talmudic readings and understandings of the Tanakh in which we don't have a face-to-face relationship with God. However, there are several accounts in the Tanakh that do talk about face-to-face relationship with God. The struggle of Jacob, the name is place in the field. That means the face. I saw the face of God. Just to cite one instance. And so also but Levinas is fearful of saying, I can have a direct relationship with God and just forget it with social ills and I can sacrifice everything to God. And in Jewish tradition, for example, forgiveness, you can't say, God, forgive me for all of this. You have to, the period from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur is you're going out asking everybody for forgiveness. And if you don't get forgiveness, it's like tough luck. And if you kill the person you want forgiveness from, you're way out of sorts. Which has happened, with the accounts of the Nazis and so on. It's like, so you're missing two dimensions of these kinds of what I'm calling vertical experiences. I think you're missing the ethical in Kierkegaard, and you're missing the religious in Levinas, and with certain clarifications. And so that's, I think, the problem that I don't want to reduce the two. I think also they have their own kind of logic as well, their own kind of structure, own kind of delusion, self-deception, and so on in each of those. And so I wouldn't want to reduce either one of those. But what I was trying to nail down in the Abrahamic is the sense of what I'm calling an absolute experience or a vertical experience. But thanks for your question. That's very good. Yeah, I mean, I think it's touching right on the problem in both of those figures. And I would have to say, though, Max Scheler doesn't reduce the two. And he's a really great source. I mean, now, you have to get through his earlier phenomenological language and stuff, and, he's still using the language of the holy as something, experience of the object and the weakness and the way. But, if you can get beyond that, which he is, he doesn't mean it in the sense that objects are experienced. These are irreducible dimensions of experience, and he's very good about that. On the Eternal in Man, it's a terrible translation. It's out of print. And it needs to be, if you want to translate something, try and retranslate it because it needs to be done. But that's a really good source. Then the Formalism book is another great source for that as well. And that's one the religious and one the ethical. And he doesn't have the problem that Kierkegaard and Levinas have. And it's odd, I'm sorry, I'm going on, I have to say, it's odd that you find these problems. Michel Henry has the same problem, if you're familiar with his work, There it's radical immanence. I mean, both he and Levinas are getting at the same stuff. Levinas in terms of, Levinas sees Husserl up, he didn't take transcendence seriously enough, let's go this way, and Henry, he didn't take immanence seriously enough, let's do that. And they're encountering the same problems. You wonder, what's the point of the world sometimes in Henry? What's the other? We're all sons of the Son, but all of this is not really my actions, it's all self-protection of God. So you wind up almost not with Levinas, but more on the Kierkegaard side. They all have problems. Marion, he's all over the place. But Scheler, I think, he at least keeps those kinds of givingness distinct. And that's an important, I think, a good phenomenological source for getting at some of the problems that you see.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
So I really like the way that you've expressed this idea that religious experiences unfold according to their own logic.
Yes.
And this idea that there's a different mode of givenness besides
Yes.
the sort of practical mode in which we encounter objects in the world
Yes.
around us.
Yeah.
So that's very cool. But so you went on to say that, okay, so if you want to evaluate or discriminate between legitimate religious experience and non-legitimate accounts of religious experience, you need to have an immanent standard. You need to generate a standard that comes from
The experiences
attention.
themselves.
From a careful attention to this special mode.
Right.
And so then you give a list of intriguing sort of criteria.
Right.
And so what I wanted to ask you, say you said a couple of things like, are these descriptions of experiences that are expansive or narrowing, or they lead us to embrace or to shrink back? Do they lead to devotion of God or to devotion to the idea of God? And you give a couple more like that. But so what I wanted to ask you is where those criteria come from, right? So what is it in the phenomenology of religious experience that would lead to those as the criteria to use to evaluate?
Yeah. Okay. Now, and I won't hunt this down if I can't find it right away. Okay. I left out a line, and so first of all, where do they come from? They come from the mystics. These kinds of things. But the line I left out because it's a long thing, and I thought I'd got to come back to it maybe. Anyway, I said, so let me just reread this thing, inserting this line that I left out again. So I said, for example, to repeat some of the features disclosed by the mystics, and on the basis of the authority of their experiences, because I left out the mystics, whom I admit I identify on the whole as having mystical experiences, or who live a religious life, and unavoidable, limited, and problematic. The problem is, then we could ask these questions. The problem, and I don't know if I have a better answer than this, is that these, so one could say, I was hoping to get by this thorny issue. Now I'm happy you raised it, really, because I do have it here. I do raise it, but it's a really good point. It's right at the heart of it. So where are we going to get these so-called criteria? Although I don't know the best way of speaking of it, but these like touchstones or whatever, right? And I'm saying from the authority of the mystics themselves. And then and what you're asking is, you're like, keep on pushing it back. You know, in other words, well, okay, so we have in St. Teresa of Avila, there are certain things, what I call the historical efficacy of prayer. And prayer is the term for her of the presence of God. So the prayer of quiet, the prayer of silence, the prayer of delight. You know, that means experience of the presence of God as calm and so on. And she'll point to some of these as genuine spiritual experiences by virtue of her own experience. St. John of the Cross was the confessor of St. Teresa. Well, St. Teresa was older, but she got messed up by earlier confessors who said, no, you know, women, they're really problematic, and, you know, you're having these experiences that really go beyond us, so it must be from the devil, you know. And so it screwed her up for 20 years. And you know, so she didn't know what to do until she finally saw, met, some other people who were saying, no, you're on the right track. And people who said, oh, this is beyond what I'm experiencing, but you're on the right track. Or St. John of the Cross, who had these other experiences. So there's an intersubjective dimension to precisely this feature. And so it's not simply on my own that I'm coming up with my own, I don't mean me, but a person experiencing like this. And who has that level of experience? And the danger of talking to someone, it's probably in all different realms that we've all had, they don't have that level of experience, and they're, you ask for advice, and, they mess you up. Okay, and then there's what she calls, what I alluded to first, the historical efficacy of prayers, like, does it have good effects? Is it a flowering of the virtues? Or am I left cold or frustrated and not sure? Or, do I wind up doing these other things that really have no bearing on what I thought were these experiences from God? So this is one way these are sorted out. Then there would have to be the testimony of those own experiences within my own experience, and to see where they would lead. So those are two ways in which they're kind of sorted out. But then the question still is, trust in the other spirit, the confessor, that they really are giving you the right advice. This is part of it too. And in this case, why are these mystics taken as the authority of this when I'm not taken like Schraber as, Dr. Schraber as the main point? And that's what I say is the kind of why hermeneutic problematic, that I'm treating these as mystics, but I'm treating them as mystics in that sense because of the structural similarity of those experiences. And you don't find that same set of structural similarities in individuals who we might think are psychopathological. They're really idiosyncratic. And what I found interesting about the Abrahamic, so confining it, so I'm not talking about the Abrahamic tradition, the sense of, for example, there are many structural similarities. Some of them are, and they use different terms, so some of them are, again, across the board, experiences that are within my power or my efforts, that are kind of experiences of God that they talk about that I can do through meditation, through spiritual discipline, so active meditation, spiritual discipline, thinking about certain things, being repentful, weeding this out of my life and so on. There's a kind of calm that I may get like this first level. And then there are others that are, and a whole sort of other ones, that are beyond my efforts. So there's a distinction in the Islamic tradition between stages and states. There's a distinction between the divine types, 5 divine types of souls, this is within the Chabad, and 5 natural kinds of souls. 5 natural kind of experiences are related to my efforts, 5 that are not related. St. Teresa of Avila, St. Teresa in the Catholic tradition at least, they are acquired prayer or infused, sometimes supernatural. And this is a basic structural similarity. And a lot of those will have also similar structural characteristics across centuries that talk about how those are discerned in terms of illusions or self-deception, or how their experience and verified within that very tradition. And they become accepted as such within the tradition. And that's the farthest really I can go on pointing that out. But you don't have that. You know, I've looked into some of the other accounts of figures who were supposed to have mystical experiences who then were also grouped as psychopathological. This is mainly from the 20th century, early 20th century, looking back at certain mystics. Joseph of Cairo, there's this whole book on this mystic Joseph Cairo, who, you know, everybody, he's clearly paranoid, he's going with this. And then they also include some others. And in some of these cases, not with him, but in some of them, there's no structural similarity at all in these kinds of experiences. And that's where I would go to say, okay, perhaps there's a kind of authority with these certain mystics that we can find to say we get, you know, the unlimitedness or some of these things that you were citing that I mentioned, you know, whether they lead to, you know, a devotion to service for the other rather than focusing on the locutions or focusing on the visions, or aren't I great? So it has to be with more expansive rather than self-focus. And beyond that, it's really hard to say where you can go. Then I don't know. The question that you're asking again is like, well, why is pride bad? Why do you focus on the self in a certain way? I mean, why can't that be a measure of something? You know, why? You know, then you get into capitalism. And I don't have an answer. Capitalism, the individualism, the self, you know, relation in which, you know, well, forget the other. And I don't think there's any. Then again, that's precisely the point. There's no justification for those criteria outside of that sphere of experience. And that's the bottom. That's almost the bottom line. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I don't know who it was. I saw you.
I'm just sort of piggybacking on her question. So you might just want to dispense with it quickly. But so if I understood your answer to her, it's not just that someone who has a mystical experience declares that they had one. It also has to do with the intersubjective communicability with people within that experience tradition. So then I guess the question becomes, since mystical experience is something which is foreign to folks, the word mystical experience comes to have a more general cultural or even psychological meaning. And so then the question for me becomes, is it just up to that community to declare it, that person plus their community to declare it a mystical experience? Or why, in other words, why can't psychologists also? I mean, we have a criteria coming from one group, and so then, you know, why not psychologists? Why not, you know, physicists? You see what I'm saying? Why doesn't it just open up at that point?
Well, I think it could, but they'd have to be unified within that, at least in the broadest sphere of tradition of recognizing this would be the Abrahamic tradition. And it's not that these people declare them. It's not like a matter of declaring these people saints. That's not the which also in these traditions mean, you know, lover, friend of God, and like the term we translate as saint for the Islamic tradition is simply friend of God. To distinguish it from Muhammad as the Rasul, messenger, which is distinct from the prophet. Okay. So I mean, it could, but then but the problem is, are the psychologists and so on functioning as psychologists or as psychologists, or in a sense as spiritual religious people? The problematic thing would have, the problematic dimension of that would be whether we're getting pronouncements from the, let's say, the psychiatrist who has no clue about religious experience, who's not interested in that, pronouncing it positively or negatively outside of that sphere of experience. It's the same problem we would have within the perceptual sphere of experience, and how this is undone or done on the givenness of the basis of another object. And you can't say, well, that's an experience of whatever object it is in this way outside of that sphere of experience.
Right, I guess that's just the question, is that the definition of whether you're within or outside of a sphere of experience. Psychologists will notice one continuous series of structural similarities between cases and then say they all had mystical experiences. People within the self-described tradition of religion will say, no, those weren't the right, you didn't pick on the right features of their experience. The structural similarities exist actually between these groups of people, and then you're off to the races.
I think if we take it in a different, if we take it into a different thing, what about like, you know, you loving someone or loving your child or something? And psychologists are saying, well, that's not really love. It's like, okay, well, you know, why are you saying? What are they looking at? Well, you see, I can read by your, you know, it's like, well, you know.
No, I understand there's
No, no,
something ineffable. No, I agree there's something ineffable about religious experience. It's just as soon as you objectify it with a label, mystical experience, then you open it up to more than just the community in which that experience is being had. Isn't that true?
I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, it's not that, for me, for example, it's not that I'm trying to say these are mystics and therefore their experiences are valid. The point is to focus on the certain structure of these, and the logic of these experiences that we call mystical. I'm not worried about the name of it like that, but that these experiences, curiously, mean something, and they have a really different logic from the way in which I can look at an object and get everybody to look at the same thing. That's all I care about. Okay. So it's not so much that dimension of it that I don't think is problematic. I don't think it's as problematic in that respect. Then it'd be a different issue, and that's where I'm. I don't want to call all mystical experiences hermeneutic. I mean, then I think that there's problematic in the sense that we treat the mystical experiences like we would treat objects. So everybody gets a say on what gets to be counted on. Then it's problematic, and then it's a new type of positivism. Okay, yeah.
I had a question about it toward the end of the paper you were talking about hermeneutical endeavor. And you say something about how hermeneutics allows for idolatry or it can.
I don't know if I said that, but you just, but go ahead, sorry.
That was my own hermeneutical endeavor.
Oh, no, I think I know what you're, but, so go ahead, sorry, go ahead.
Well, it came right after the questions that Professor Tolera brought up about do these experiences make me more prideful or humble? And I was wondering about, you bring up the problematic of taking a hermeneutical stance in respect to these experiences. And I'm just wondering how the experience of the holy relates to, say, interpreting scripture and interpreting ourselves with respect to moral evaluations of God.
Yeah. In terms of scripture, all the ones that I've read will always appeal to scripture. But what's very interesting is that many of their descriptions of some of their descriptions will come in conflict with scripture. And some of them will even affirm those experiences over what they read in scripture. To be safe, I mean, the mystics, well, St. Teresa of Avila, the book of her life was held by the Inquisition for 15 years. And then she wrote the Interior Council. But, so, she was under the gun. She would say, hey, if you don't like it, burn it. And they never condemned her, and they never burned it. But, I don't want to say, and then you have the problem, and even worse, within Islam, of like conformity to scripture. I mean, you have what's called ecstatic sayings, and ecstatic expressions or ecstatic sayings like halaj and Mastami, who say, I am the truth, or I am God, basically. And, halaj was torn limb from limb. So there's a question of what do we mean by union in this case? Who is the I? Is there an I that's speaking? Is there any traditional sense of I in a statement like that goes beyond logic? So they're very concerned about how they're going to justify their experiences, and they appeal to Scripture. So there is a contextual element to this appeal to Scripture. On the other hand, many of the recording of their experiences conflict with Scripture. And you find them across the board too, because what is rooted is the experience of God, the experience of the holy. So St. Teresa of Avila will say sometimes, it says in, I don't know which gospel account it was, but, Mary did this, and Jesus did this. He goes, no way I believe that. It has to do with the integrity of the body, as a matter of fact, and the humanity of Jesus in this case. It's interesting because she's really an interesting person in terms of taking the body seriously, despite her, this is bad and so on. But it's really a reaffirmation of the body in light of the spiritual dimension. So it's not really a denigration of the body, but and the fact that she focuses on the humanity of Jesus or of Christ, faithless on that, but on the humanity, on the passion. These are things that some of the male mystics weren't concerned with. And she said, no, they couldn't have meant that when that was written like this. I'm like, okay, well, how is that going to confirm these experiences? Now, St. John of the Cross is saying, I know you're concerned, and he's saying himself, I know you're concerned about the locutions, the visions, and everything, but we're never going to know if they're really authentic. So just forget it. Just keep on doing what you're doing, and like that. St. Teresa says, yes, that's true. But still, I wanted to test whether these experiences are really true or not. And the point of that was not because she wanted to do phenomenology, but because she wanted to help the other nuns not have the same problems that she had, and to say, if you're experiencing something like this, it's probably problematic. If you're experiencing something like this, you might want to continue in this way because it might be okay. And this was meant more like a text to help the people, the novices, continue on a certain path. So the relationship with Scripture was often ambivalent, and they couldn't say no, what we're saying about Muhammad and everything that's wrong. You have lots of experiences in wisdom on Ali, and he's not the only one that simply almost put themselves in the position of a prophet. But you can't, because Muhammad was a sealed prophet. So they can't say that. So they have to be the friend of God, the wali, And so you're in this tangle, but the experiences are the final court of appeal, I found, in these. And so that's where they are.
The question has been asked a couple of times, so again, maybe
Yeah.
I want to go back to the notion of the different logics.
Yeah.
And when you first mentioned this, it made a lot of sense to me, given what you were trying to express with different modes of givenness, right? And that there has to be this kind of internal standard and criteria, and so of course it will be a different logic.
Okay.
But I'm wondering, and this might relate to David's question, if you could talk a little bit about translation between logics, because it seems that we have to, right, in order to describe the logic, we have to be able to, in some way, describe it in terms of a different kind of given. Is that the case?
Yeah, okay.
And can you say,
I
can
know
you
what
just
you
talk a
mean.
little bit more
Yeah,
about that?
sure, I know what you mean. Okay, so there's two levels of this. One, I would say we can describe these different kinds of givenness. Logic is probably a bad term, but I want to get a sense that there's an integrity, internal
Right,
coherence
right.
to them. But okay. So in the first case, I think and I don't think there's a problematic and unproblematic. Unproblematic, I believe, is that these experiences are experienced when we say, like, it's immediate as opposed to mediated. When I see someone and I'm struck by someone, that's a different experience of like, turning the foreground back, going all around horizons and all that, which is great. I mean, the effective force of the object as opposed to, or in distinction to being struck by someone. There's something else going on there. So we can speak of immediacy. We can speak of spontaneity of the experience. We can speak of something lasting longer or deeper an experience than another one. So that I think is okay. But I think you're alluding to probably something more problematic, and that's perhaps, and that's when the mystics describe these experiences using language from what we're used to in the perceptual realm to describe not how we characterize that evidence necessarily, but these experiences themselves. And that's why I'm sorry I left that section out because time considers that, but it concerned the use of imagery and the use of metaphor, and it's everywhere. Now, what's interesting is, on the one hand, the mystics always say, "I cannot express this. I cannot." Who writes the most? The mystics write more than anybody. I mean, they just won't be quiet because. And what's interesting is, like, it's not that I can't say it, but I say it, but it's never exhaustive. And there's a list, this long. I'm just thinking centuries Babylon, you know, of her experience of like a sponge, a turtle, or whatever, you know, that God is a jewel and treasure and so on and so on, and spouse and king and so on. It goes on, and the Islamic Muslims even more. And they have to resort to imagery. But I think that's kind of put it in a negative way. The positive way is for, there's a term that the Sufis use that basically means beautiful. And this is a characteristic of God, beauty. So if we're going to, I mean, poetry in the Islamic tradition was, people would record things in poetic verse in the way that we write newspapers today. It would be communicated like this. And so it's not unusual in Rumi and all these other who write in Attar and those who write in verse. This is the way it was done. And it was because it was beautiful. And this was closer to God. So it wouldn't be, you wouldn't want to use, you know, analytic descriptive prose to characterize these experiences. You'd have to use imagery, not because you have to, but because this would be the way to do it. So this would be the reverse. Like we think of imagery, I do. You know, at first when I'm reading imagery, let's not, you know, we don't want the imagery, we want the kind of back, well, there's all sorts of literature on metaphor and, you know, literalness and so on. But that's the best way of describing it. So as a matter of fact, there wouldn't be a problem with resorting to imagery borrowed from, you know, like in the song, the Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, you know, the imagery of what can be read as an erotic encounter with another human being, or the relationship between Israel and God, or the relationship between an individual, to the mystics will interpret it as a relationship with God and a relationship with God, the love song, the relationship with God. That this imagery is essential for evoking, because the point of these, and this is essential, I think, the point of these descriptions across the board is not to provoke these experiences in another. It's not to describe them in a kind of purified discourse, but to evoke. So language has an evocative sense. And can I evoke? Can I get someone to maybe see what I'm seeing? That's the point. And it's successful if it evokes, not if it has a literal thing. So the problem is not like, it would be problematic if I'm simply borrowing from the level of perception to say all of this. But that would be if I'm provoking, or if I'm using it as indicative speech. But it's not problematic if we're attuned to the evocative character of language. Yeah, I mean, it's important issue. Yeah.
It would seem to me that there's an interesting person, and she may not have been included in the scope who you look at with respect to mystics, Stein. And specifically, after reading Teresa of Avila, had this experience where she said, this is truth, and the life of her path, the path of her life, just changed so dramatically. Certainly, she could look at it from a phenomenological perspective, and she lived 20 years after that point in time. Surely she must have written something.
Well, I mean, there wasn't a whole lot that she was able to write, but she was another Carmelite that one could appeal to, right? Exactly. There's also, well, yes, as a matter of fact, I mentioned her a little bit, but not in these. These are not the main ones that I work with. Simone Weil is another really good example. Contemporary person. There are so many sources